Our agenda today will be to start out by talking about why we do validation, what the scope is, what are the benefits of it, because there are huge benefits to doing validation, and we really need to understand that. We'll talk about what the regulatory expectations are for validation. We'll go through some of the requirements in production and process controls, which describe what we need to do for validation and how that connects to other parts of the quality system. Validation doesn't stand on its own. It's part of a network of processes, so we need to understand how it's linked to other parts of your quality system. Those linkages are important to making things work. As we go along, we'll talk about some lessons learned. Some companies out there have had some major problems with validation, and it's easier to learn from their examples than having to go through them yourself. We'll discuss the concept of master validation planning. We'll go through some of the myths, the challenges, and best practices. And we'll finish up by talking about what you need to be doing to be ready for an FDA inspection, because they are going to come look at some point on how you did validation. We know that even though the regulations were written over 20 years ago now, companies still have problems with it. So I see lots of companies getting warning letters or 483s for validation issues, and that's a shame. Those things can be avoided. But even more importantly, I see companies having quality problems. And you'll see these in medical device reports or even recalls that companies are experiencing. So let's begin by talking about the regulatory expectations and what you need to know about IQ, OQ, and PQ. So the first thing we want to do is look to the FDA regulations. If you're selling product in the US, you need to understand the quality systems regulation found in 21 CFR Part 820. In particular, we'll look at 820.3, paragraph C, which contains some applicable definitions. We'll go through 820.75, which talks about the requirements for process validation. We'll touch on 820.30 paragraph G, which covers design validation. Now, this is not a course on design controls today, but we do need to know that there is a linkage between design validation and process validation. 820.70 paragraph G contains requirements for equipment that we need to understand and make sure we cover when we do the IQ phase of validation. 820.70 paragraph I talks about software validation. The other places we look for information are ISO 13485, the 2016 version. Most companies should be well on their way to that. By now, if you're selling product or in Europe or other markets, you need to understand ISO 13485. We'll also touch a little bit on the concept of risk management per ISO 14971. One of the big things we want to do when we do our process validation is reduce the risks. We want to understand what makes our process work, what things can go wrong, and put in place measures to prevent that from happening. So that's where ISO 14971 comes into play. Additional resources that I can recommend to you are some FDA guidance documents. They have a small entity compliance guide, which has chapters 4 and 7 that are useful. Since the regulations were written in 1996, the concepts of software validation have changed a lot. So the FDA has a document called the General Principles of Software Validation that gives you a lot more of the of detail, and it tells you the FDA's current thinking on software. There is also a really good design control guidance, which talks a lot about the linkage between design validation, how that needs to be done on product that comes off of a validated process. And it also talks about the concept of design transfer, how you share information from design phase to the manufacturing phase, and how that's applicable to process validation. The FDA also has their QSIT guidance, or Quality Systems Inspection Technique. They call that their Guide to Inspections of Quality Systems. And the FDA tells you exactly what they're going to look for when they come in and do an inspection. So it's worth reading that document. Now, the best place for looking for information is the IMDRF website. IMDRF is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. It replaced GHTF, and they have a lot of guidance documents. And their guidance document on that website on process validation is extremely useful, and I recommend that everybody look at that in detail. We'll be covering the concepts in this course, but go to that for backup because it's a really useful document. The FDA has partnered with other regulators to do MDSAP audits, Medical Device Single Audit Program, and they will use that as their guidance, as their standard. All right, so let's begin with definitions from 21 CFR 820.3, paragraph C. Here we start out with a generic definition of validation. Validation is confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence that particular requirements for a specific intended use can be consistently fulfilled. Well, let's break that down. Confirmation means you have to provide the proof, the objective evidence, the data to show that you did this. And you have to do examination. That means testing. So you have to describe what it is you're testing, what the use is of this, what it is you're testing, what requirements you're testing to. And there's another important word in that sentence, consistently fulfilled. Consistently is an important word. So you can't just say, well, you know, we had the engineer make 1 or 2 products in the lab and it was great. That's not consistently. You have to show that you can do this under your normal operating conditions, and you have to do a sufficient number of products to show consistency. That means you're going to have to use some statistical techniques. And we'll get into that in more detail as we go along. Now, we can't cover statistics in our 90 minutes today, but it is an important concept, and it means you have to have people with valid statistical knowledge on your team. Now, process validation is a specific case of validation. It means establishing by objective evidence. So there's again the requirement for proof. But here's where it's different. Here we have to see that we want to see that a process consistently produces a result or product meeting its predetermined specifications. So this is showing that your manufacturing processes produce acceptable product. And there's an extremely important term in there, predetermined specifications. That means when you're doing this testing, you have to say up front what it is you're trying to prove. What are your specifications? What is your criteria for success? Then you go out and do the testing, and then you report on whether you met those predetermined specifications. Now, I see so many companies get in trouble for this requirement. Please don't be one of those. Know that you have to state up front what your criteria are, what you're trying to prove. Now, design validation is different. Here we see that it means establishing by objective evidence. Okay, we know what that means. But here it changes. The device specifications conform with user needs and intended uses. So this is saying the products you make are safe and effective for your users. You meet their needs. So process validation shows that the process can make acceptable product. Design validation takes that product and shows that it meets user needs and intended uses. Verification is very different. Verification means confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence. Now that sounds similar, but the rest of it is specified requirements have been fulfilled. So the specified requirement can be a dimension, and all what you have to do is say you met that dimension. That's something that can be inspected. And that's one of the concepts that we're going to explore more. Think of verification as inspection or testing. Let's dig a little bit deeper so we can explore that concept more. So if we go to the regulation, 21 CFR 820.75, the requirements for process validation say that where the results of a process cannot be fully verified by subsequent inspection and test, the process shall be validated with a high degree of assurance and approved according to established procedures. So let's break that down a little bit. Let's tackle, first of all, establish, what that means. So the FDA, when they use the term establish, and it's practically in every paragraph of the regulation, it means that you've taken the regulations and you've transferred it into your own written procedures with adequate level of detail on how to do things. The regulations tell you what to do. Your procedures have to provide enough detail on how to do them. You have to implement those procedures by training personnel to follow those procedures. And you have to have records to show that you follow your own procedures. So that's a broad burden. And those are the things that the FDA is going to be looking for. So they're going to want to see that you trained your personnel to your own procedures, your validation procedure. They'll want to see records. So don't be surprised by that. Now, I also want to dig into that sentence in red because it's really important there. What they're saying is if you can't verify the outputs by doing inspection and testing, by measuring that dimension on every single part, then you have to validate the process with a high degree of assurance. So we're going to talk about how you do that with a high degree of assurance. And of course, that has to be done according to established procedures. So let's dig deeper into this concept of verification versus validation. So this little flow chart comes to us from the GHTF guidance document that I was telling you about. And it helps you decide when you need to verify or when you should be validating. So in the old days, we used to talk about special processes. Processes like heat treating or plating or coatings. where you couldn't look at the part, you couldn't measure the part and tell if it was properly heat treated. The only way to tell that was by destructive testing, by cutting it up. Likewise, you can't look at a product in a Tyvek pouch and tell if it's been properly sterilized, because just by examining it to see if it's sterile, you're going to destroy the sterility aspect. So you have to validate. Now today we don't use that term special process anymore because we've evolved our thinking and we don't want to have to rely on inspection to see if our product is good. We want to rely on validation. So the first question to ask yourself is the one in the upper left-hand corner. Is the process output verifiable? Can I physically measure or inspect every characteristic on that part to see if it's acceptable? And if the answer is no, then I have to validate, or I have to start over and redesign my product or process. But if I can't physically measure or inspect every characteristic, I have to validate. Now, the second question becomes, well, even if you can verify, even if you can do 100% inspection, is that sufficient and cost-effective? Do I want to rely on 100% inspection after the fact to sort out my good and bad products? We know that 100% inspection is not 100% effective. And we don't want to do it after the fact. You really don't want to do that very frequently. But if you say, you know, it's okay, it's so simple, it's a simple process, we're going to rely on 100% inspection, then go ahead and do that. But really think about doing validation instead, because validation helps you understand your process. It helps you optimize your process. It helps you build quality in as opposed to relying on after-the-fact inspection. So I think this is a really good way of distinguishing between when you want to verify and when you want to validate. Now, back to the regulation. We need to establish and maintain procedures that include some requirements. Validation needs to be performed by qualified individuals. So you're going to have to say who's qualified and have records to show that they're qualified or trained to your procedures or to the protocol themselves. So if you're going to write a protocol and have a manufacturing operator conduct that, you'll want to show that you trained that operator to follow the protocol. You'll need to have a record, a training record to approve that. The quality engineer who analyzes the data, how are they qualified? Are they a certified quality engineer? Expect the FDA to ask for this information. Don't be surprised. Your procedures need to provide detail on the monitoring and control methods you use, the data, the date, and the personnel who do validation activities. So your procedures should require those things. And they explicitly say when changes or deviations occur, the manufacturer shall review, evaluate, and revalidate. So here we see that validation is not a static thing. It's not a one-time and you're done activity. If there's changes, if there's trends, if there's deviations, you have to review, evaluate, and revalidate. So now let's talk about the 3 elements of process validation, what we typically call the IQ, OQ, PQ, or the installation qualification, the operational qualification, and the performance qualification. Now, those are very commonly used terms in industry. Does anybody know where they come from? They're not found anywhere in the regulations. They're not in the quality system regulation, and they're not in ISO 13485. The place where we see those terms is that GHTF guidance document that I was telling you about. And those terms have become very commonly used. FDA inspectors, notified bodies are used to those terms. Now, they're not required per regulation, so you don't have to use those terms. You can call it whatever you want. But I tend to think that those are very useful terms, and they meet the expectations of the regulation. The only place I see a slightly different terminology is in that medical device quality system manual, and they've kind of combined the IQ, OQ in one phase, and then they do a PPQ. But I think IQ, OQ, PQ is the commonly used terminology, and it's what I recommend that you use. Now, when we do validation activities, there are going to be some general documents that we're going to use, whether it's an IQ, OQ, or a PQ. We're going to write a protocol ahead of time. The protocol describes what it is we're trying to prove, why we're doing this. It provides all the detail on how to do the validation, what equipment is used, etc. And most importantly, it's the place where you put that predetermined specifications. What are your criteria for pass or fail in the testing that you're about to do? It's really important that you put your predetermined specifications in there. Then you're going to go out and you're going to do the testing, and you're going to provide verification, the proof that you did all of the testing. So you'll show all your data points and your test results. You're going to analyze that data, and then you're going to write a report with your conclusions that say whether or not you met your predetermined specifications, whether or not you passed or failed your validation. All right, now let's dig into the IQ, the installation qualification. So this is the first step here, and this is all about establishing confidence that your process equipment and ancillary systems are capable of consistently operating within established limits and tolerances. So you're going to have to describe what those conditions are and what those established limits are. You want to prove that the equipment is installed properly and you're following the recommendations of the supplier of that equipment. At this phase, we're going to turn on the machine, we're going to run it, but we're not making any product with it yet, not officially. So this is the IQ phase. So we want to follow the recommendations of the supplier or the manufacturer of that equipment. Just like when you go out and buy a new car, you're going to get an operating manual, you're going to get a maintenance manual from the manufacturer of that car. And if you go out and buy a piece of capital equipment, you should be getting the same information. So you want to get any manuals that come with it. You want to get the specifications for that equipment and make sure that matches what you ordered. You want to know what software is in there, what version or configuration level of the software is in there. You want to know what the operating parameters are for this equipment. Does it need a special foundation? Does it need to be hooked up to utilities? Make sure you meet those requirements. And we're going to perform some worst case equipment on that, worst case testing on that equipment. So we're going to run it at the highest speed and the lowest speed, at the highest temperature and the lowest temperature. We just want to be sure that this machine runs like it's supposed to. The documents we're going to need are a pre-approved protocol with our criteria for success and instructions for how to do these activities. Now, if you install more than one piece of equipment on your manufacturing floor, there's probably going to be some similar things you have to do. So most companies will have a checklist of activities that you want to start with. And you'll want to take that checklist and you're going to want to verify that all of the activities have been completed and record that information. At a minimum, what we want to look for at this phase is that the equipment is properly identified, we've installed it properly, we've connected it to inputs or ancillary equipment, we've set it up and calibrated it properly, and we know how to maintain that equipment. Let's dig a little deeper. In terms of identifying that piece of equipment, you'll want to get it a unique serial number. And some companies also have a property number for financial purposes. You'll want to describe where and when it was installed. You want to get the operating manuals and label them with that unique serial number. You'll want to describe if you need any spare parts for routine or non-routine maintenance and make sure they are identified with that serial number. Check your purchase order and make sure that the specifications match what you ordered. You're going to want to install that equipment on your manufacturing floor, following the manufacturer's requirements. Now, if you think you know better and you're not going to follow the manufacturer's requirements, then you should have a valid, documented rationale for that. Don't make the mistake of just telling an FDA inspector, hey, we didn't do it that way. We think we know better. Have a rationale, a valid rationale. And you're going to want to show that you met all of the recommendations. So if they said it needs a particular foundation or utilities, make sure you follow those recommendations. You want to verify that the equipment is hooked up to any equipment, to any inputs or ancillary equipment. So you need to know what the connection requirements are, what the interface protocols are. Do you plug it in and then turn it on, or which order do things need to happen? Do you know what the utility requirements are? The next thing you want to do is put this equipment in your calibration and maintenance programs. Follow your SOPs for those activities. So show that any gauges on that equipment are calibrated and you've put the equipment in your maintenance program. When we're talking about maintenance, what are the requirements for maintenance for this equipment? Are we going to do routine maintenance based on usage, either time or cycles So for your car, it could be changing the oil every 5,000 miles or every 6 months. You have to describe what your approach is for this piece of equipment. You're going to want to create a logbook for that equipment that shows when any maintenance activities occurred or whenever that machine experienced any non-routine downtime. And you'll want to describe what spare parts you need over time. So common problems that we see during the IQ phase is companies just don't verify all their activities. They don't verify that they hooked it up to the utilities, or they put it in the maintenance or calibration program. If you don't have a record that enters it into the maintenance program, then you can't prove you did it. So you have to provide the records. Remember, that's a part of the FDA's expectation that you've established a procedure. The next phase is the OQ. So this is where we are going to turn the equipment on, and we want to show that the equipment and the process to run it produce acceptable product. We're going to explore the worst case limits, the highest temperature and the lowest temperature, to see what our range is. What's our operating range? Where do we want to stay within? And this is really an important phase because this is where we are really learning about what makes our process work, what the inputs are to this process, and how we optimize the process. This is really the beauty of doing validation, is we optimize our process. Now, we are going to make product at this phase, but it's trial product. It's not fully validated, so you cannot treat it as a saleable product. It's non-conforming material. You cannot sell it. You cannot use it on human beings. You need to label it non-conforming material. You need to put stickers on the product, not for sale, not for human use. You need to control this product because it hasn't gone through the PQ phase. We're running at the extremes. We don't know if we're really going to pass at this point. So it's non-conforming material. What we want to do in this phase is we want to establish our process control limits. So we want to take all of the process inputs, time, temperature, pressure, etc., and say these are our limits for this. We're going to run within this temperature range or this speed range. If the equipment contains software, we're going to want to validate the software independently. Once we know about running this equipment, we're going to write our SOPs for that process. And when we run our PQ, we're going to use those established procedures. We're going to put the procedures under change control, version control. We're going to want to train people who need to be trained. So any of the operators, maintenance personnel who need to maintain that equipment, we want to create all those training records. Remember, you have to have records to prove you did these things. The next thing we want to do is characterize our process and describe what can go wrong with those process. And the perfect tool to do that is called an FMEA, Failure Modes Effects Analysis, where we take each of the process inputs and we say what can go wrong. Okay, temperature is a variable. What happens if the temperature is too high? What happens if the temperature is too low? And we can describe the effects of those conditions. What's the severity of those effects? How likely are we going to be to notice or detect this issue? And from there, we create a risk number, a risk priority number. And then we take steps to reduce those risks. And that's where we employ the concepts of ISO 14971, risk management. And this is really a big part of understanding your process and optimizing it. And it's to your benefit to do this well. It's going to help you get better yields, reduce scrap, reduce non-conforming material. You're going to get more consistent outputs. And that's what your customers want. They want safe and effective product. So it's good to really understand your process. Now, to do this, we're going to have to show that our process is stable and in control. And that means we're going to have to do some statistical process controls. Now, that's a huge topic and way beyond our 90 minutes today. But I do want to emphasize that the regulations require that you use valid statistical techniques. So your process validation procedures should require that. You should have a separate procedure on what valid statistical techniques are. And you need to make sure that you have some qualified personnel in your company to do those things, like a certified quality engineer. Now, optimizing the process is really what we want to do. We want to understand what. So that means we're going to have to do a little bit of homework. We're going to have to do a little bit of testing. And you want to do some testing before you do your formal validation. You want to have enough familiarity with your process so that when you run your formal validation protocol, you're confident in passing. So do some empirical testing to understand what your process variables are. Is it time, temperature, pressure, speed that make a difference? Where are you going to want to set those variables at? Or you can even do some more advanced techniques like using the design of experiment. And this is where we want to understand what our process controls and limits are. So we're going to have to use some baseline information. We need to know what our design specifications are, so we make sure that the process can deliver them. We may do some pilot studies ahead of time or just some empirical testing. But we want to know what our variables are and how to control them over time. We want to know what our process outputs are. And you should be able to look at your process over time and understand what the distribution of your outputs are. Are you getting a bell-shaped curve of your outputs? And do you know what the shape, center, and spread are for that bell-shaped curve over time? So you want to understand what your process can produce, shape, center, and spread over time. Our assumptions when we do these things is that the operator is trained and we have records to demonstrate that. Procedures are followed and we have written procedures all ready to go. And we've already done the IQ and we know that the equipment is functional. So the minimum things we want to get out of our OQ are to make sure we have written procedures that are complete and workable. We've done software validation if necessary. We know what our process inputs or variables are, and we know what the limits for them are. We've optimized our process. We've characterized our process, and we know what failures could occur. And we're going to perform worst case studies. So in terms of procedures that should be established, you'll want to have routine operating procedures. You'll also want to make sure that you have a maintenance schedule, that you've put the equipment in the calibration program, and you're following those requirements. Does this equipment need special startup or shutdown procedures? When you start it up on Monday morning, does it need time to warm up? Do you have to run some test parts through there? Do you have to do a line clearance? And is there something at the end of the week for how you shut it down properly? You want to make sure that the equipment has a process log so that you're logging any maintenance, either routine or non-routine adjustments to that equipment. Now, software is a big topic, and we could spend a couple of days on that alone, but we can't in our 90 minutes today. But you do want to make sure that if the equipment has software in it, you validate that software. You demonstrate that the software is compatible with the hardware. You know what the configuration or version of the software is. You know that it interfaces properly. And you want to challenge the software and see if it does what it's supposed to do. If the machine is running along and you open the door, does the software shut it off? Do you get an error code that tells you what happened? During the OQ, we also want to run worst case studies. So we want to run the equipment at its full range of settings that may be used. The fastest speed and the lowest speed, the highest temperature, the lowest temperature. And we want to show that even at those extremes, we're still getting acceptable product out of that. So that's the OQ. Really, it's all about optimizing our process. Now we're ready for the PQ. We've done all our homework, and now we want to show that our process is capable of consistently producing a product that meets its predetermined specifications. So consistency is an important word. We can't just run one or two products and show our process is consistent. We need to understand the normal variation of our process. We want to be able to understand what our process will normally produce. Now, in the short run variation is always less than long-term variation, but we need to try and simulate some variation in our process. So over a long period of time, you're going to run that process. It might get run in the cold, dry winters and the hot, humid summers. You might have different shifts, different operators running it. Over a long period of time, you're going to get different lots of material. There'll be different setups. The machine will have had different repairs, different routine maintenance over a long period of time. So you're going to get variation in the outputs of your process. And during your PQ, you want to show a little bit of your process variation. So what we're going to do is we're going to do rigorous testing for the PQ, and we're going to run at nominal settings now. And we're going to do repetitive testing, probably at least 3 or more batches. We're going to try and simulate some of that variation. And now don't try to play games here and think, well, if I have to run 3 batches, that's a lot of work, so I'm just going to make them teeny-weeny little batches. That's not acceptable. That's not good for you because you don't know what your variation is. That's not good for your customers because they're taking all the risk of getting a bad product. And the FDA is going to figure out that you're playing games. So don't. So make at least 3 or more batches. Use materials that come in through your normal receiving inspection activities. Use the process parameters you've established during OQ. And you're going to want to take this product and show that it meets the predetermined specifications that you've defined in your protocol. And you want to show that your process is capable and consistent. That means you're going to have to use some appropriate statistical methods. The regulations require appropriate statistical methods. So we're going to run production at nominal. Our batch size is going to be our normal production lot size. And from that batch, from those batches, we're going to collect and test some samples. The sample size needs to be statistically justified. So you're randomly going to take samples and we're going to test them. And if that means destructive testing, that's what we're going to do. And then we're going to analyze the test results. Now, you're going to need to come up with a really good rationale for what your sample size and sampling plan is and how you're going to randomly select those samples from your 3 batches. A CQE would be qualified to help you do that. And then we're going to test those samples using validated test methods. So this is another place where companies mess up. You have to use validated test methods, calibrated gauges. If you're using an uncalibrated gauge, your data is going to be suspect. And then you're going to analyze that data and see what it means. And you have to analyze all of the data, including any outliers. If you see some bias, you have to talk about it and what it means. Don't try to hide the data. It's to your benefit to thoroughly understand it. What we want to do is calculate process capability. So we want to show that our process is capable of meeting our specifications, the predetermined specifications. We want to see that it's capable of doing that consistently and reliably. So there are different techniques we can use. We can use a calculation called a CPK. We can look at the average, the median, and standard deviation. We can use X-bar and R charts. But you'll want to make sure that you have qualified personnel that use appropriate statistical techniques. Your appropriate statistical techniques should be described in your own procedures. Your qualified individuals, you should describe what is qualified and make sure you meet that. And once we do that, then we're going to create a final report that says whether we met our predetermined acceptance criteria or not. Now, if you met your predetermined determined acceptance criteria, that's great. But if you didn't meet them, be very careful. I know a lot of companies, who say, well, we're going to sample 300 pieces and 298 of them have to be good to pass, but we only got 297. And then they say, well, that's close enough. We'll say we met our criteria anyway. We'll write some justification. That's a really bad mistake to make. If you didn't meet your criteria for success, it means you didn't do your homework. You got surprised, and you need to do a failure investigation and a root cause analysis, because otherwise you're going to get surprised again in the future. And you're going to have scrap, you're going to have non-conforming material, or even worse, you're going to have bad product get out to your customers. So if you don't meet your criteria for success, don't try to justify why it's okay. Make sure that high-level people are involved in that decision. It's a big risk to take, and the FDA is going to look very carefully at it. I know that a lot of times there's pressure to do that, but it's a big mistake. You need to show all of your test results and your analysis of the data and create a final report that summarizes your results. Were there any problems that occurred? Did you have any deviations? Did you have any non-conformances? Did the equipment happen to break down in the middle of your run? You're going to have to discuss those and what the impact of that is. So that's the PQ. When you're done with that, the product will be saleable pending other things like design validation and approvals, etc. It doesn't end there, though. Once you've done the PQ, you still have to monitor your process over time to show that it still remains stable and in control. And that means you're still going to have to sample from every batch and use SPC to show that you're staying in a state of control. So some general principles, you're going to want to write protocols ahead of time that contain details on how to do things, what are your requirements for doing them, personnel, training, records, outputs. Those protocols are approved ahead of time. Then you execute to them and you provide the documentation of that. Your final report should summarize your data. It should state your conclusions, and that needs to be based on facts, on the data, not on opinions. You want to document all your test results. You want to document any formulas, statistical techniques that were used, like we calculated a CPK using this formula. You want to document anything that happened during your validation. Were there any deviations or nonconformances? How did you investigate them? Document all changes that were made and explain any deviations from the protocol. If the operator was supposed to pull 2 samples every hour and he forgot 1 hour, what does that mean? What are you going to do about it? So that's the IQ, the OQ, the PQ. The IQ is all about making sure the equipment is installed, but we're not making any product yet. OQ is all about optimizing our process, understanding what makes it work, what are the right settings. And PQ is saying, okay, now we're going to take that process, we're going to run at nominal, and we want to show that our process is stable, in control, and capable. All right, so now let's shift gears and talk about a few other concepts to pull this all together. Production and process changes. The regulations specifically talk about production and process changes, and they say that changes shall be verified or validated before implementation. So if you've previously validated a process and you change it, you need to revalidate it. It's explicitly required. Process control requirements. 21 CFR 820.75, paragraph B, says you shall establish and maintain procedures for monitoring and control of process parameters for validated processes to ensure specified requirements continue to be met. So after you're done with the PQ, you still have to monitor your process. You need to use appropriate statistical methods and show that your process is stable, produces a consistent level of performance where the total variation is reduced, and it needs to be capable, meaning the product variation needs to fit within your upper and lower specification limits. So this is an ongoing process, and you're going to have to show for every batch of product you make that you've done these things. Equipment requirements. 21 CFR 820.70 talks about equipment, and they say that you need to ensure all equipment used in the manufacturing process meets specified requirements. So you're going to define those ahead of time. It needs to be appropriately designed, constructed, placed, and installed to facilitate maintenance, adjustments, cleaning, and use. This is what you're going to prove in the IQ. This is why you're doing the IQ before the OQ and the PQ. So you have to put it in your maintenance program. You have to allow inspection and adjustment. Automated processes need to fulfill the requirements of 21 CFR 820.70, paragraph I, which requires validation of computer software. So again, that's a huge topic, and we could spend a couple of days on that. But I do encourage you to look at the FDA guidance document and come to some of our other webinars on that topic. Now let's talk about what the FDA is going to look for when they come in and inspect you. The FDA uses the QSIT technique, Quality System Inspection Technique. And they've outlined this in a document, Guide to Inspections, and you can go on the FDA.gov website and put QSIT in, and you'll get the document, and you'll see exactly what the FDA is going to look for. The FDA breaks the quality system into 7 parts. And of those 7 parts, they routinely look at 4. Management in the middle, and the 3 purple blocks there. And the 3 are in purple because the FDA looks at those, and all of those 3 are going to open the door for the FDA to look at how you do validation. The FDA always looks at CAPA, and when they look at CAPA, they're going to look for indicators of quality problems, of validation problems, and they're going to pull your validation reports, and they're going to see what happened, what went wrong. If the FDA looks at design controls, they're going to want to see that design validation was done on product from a validated process, and they're going to want to see that you transferred the design to manufacturing. They're going to pull the thread and see how you did process validation. And if the FDA looks at production and process controls, they're going to look at a lot of the things we explicitly talked about today. So it's highly likely the FDA is going to look at validation when they come in to inspect you. When the FDA comes in, their approach, this is what the FDA says in the guidance document. This is what they tell their investigators. They say, select a process, a validation process, based on CAPA indicators. So start by looking at CAPAs, and where you see problems, those are the processes we want you to examine for validation. Or they say, pick a process that's used on a higher risk device. So if you make some class 2s and one class 3, they're going to pick the class 3, especially if you had a quality problem. They're going to look at that, especially if you had a recall or MDRs. They're going to look at processes that they perceive as high risk in terms of causing device failures. So sealing processes, sterilization processes, and you can decide whatever your high-risk processes are on your products. You will know that better. Those are the ones the FDA is going to look for. They're going to examine processes that they think you're unfamiliar with, perhaps the newest process you've put in place. They're not going to look at things they already looked at. They're going to pick something different. And they may pick a process that's important to several products that you make. Bottom line, they're looking for your high-risk processes. The first thing the FDA wants to do is they want to see your rules and assumptions for how you do validation. So they're going to want to see they're going to ask for your procedures. They're going to see how you do validation. Do you use the terms IQ, OQ, PQ, which we said at the beginning are not required in the regulation, but they're industry terminology. They're going to look for how you do that and what your assumptions are. The second thing they want to do is make sure that where required, you used predetermined product or process specifications and characteristics. And they're going to want to look at your details and see how did you derive at that process specification? What data did you get? What statistical techniques did you use to arrive at those specifications? And then they're going to take this process and they're going to say, okay, here are the important input variables, time, temperature, or pressure, whatever you said. And they're going to want to see how you arrived at that conclusion. Did you do testing? Did you do a DOE to decide what are the important variables? And then they're going to want to take one of those variables and see how you decided what the appropriate operating range was. What data did you have to support the temperature from X to Y or the speed from A to B? How did you know that was the right range? Where's your data to support that? And they're going to want to see what can happen if you run outside of your ranges. So if the temperature is too high or too low, what will happen? What if the speed is too high or too low? Do you have any data to support that? The next thing they're going to want to look at is looking at your test method. So any testing that you're going to do, they want to see was used a valid test method. So they're going to see that that test method was validated itself, the gauge was calibrated, and it's in a state of calibration. If you have a questionable test method, then basically all your results will be questionable. Don't make this mistake. They're going to want to see that you understand your process and what can go wrong. They're going to want to see if you did risk management activities like doing a failure modes and effects analysis. Do you know what all the possible failure modes are? What rates can you expect them to occur at? Are you looking for those? Are you trying to detect them? What is your control for preventing that from happening? Here's what the FDA tells their investigators. Your validation review should include looking at the instruments that were used to generate objective evidence and see if they were calibrated and maintained prior to validation. They're going to look for predetermined specifications. So you said up front what it is you're trying to achieve. They want to see that your test sampling plans were based on statistically valid rationale. So your protocol should say, here's our sampling plan, and here's why we chose it. They're going to look for objective evidence that indicates the predetermined specifications were consistently met. They want to see that process equipment was properly installed, adjusted, and maintained. They want to see that any monitoring instruments were properly calibrated and maintained. So expect them to ask for those records. Frequently, we'll see the FDA investigator go out to the shop floor and write down some equipment numbers, some gauge numbers, and then say, I want to see the records for calibration and maintenance on this. The FDA wants to see that process operators were appropriately qualified. So expect them to ask for the records that operator A was trained on the process and knows how to run that process routinely, and they also were trained on the protocol itself. They'll ask for those records. Don't be surprised. Be ready. All right. So validation is a complex process working within a quality system, a network of other processes that have to work together. So let's talk about some of those linkages. Process validation does have a strong linkage to design control. As we said, design validation needs to occur on a product from a validated process. Design transfer means you've shared knowledge from the design organization with the manufacturing organization who's doing the process validation. So you need to show that. If you have any problems, if you have any issues during validation, if you have any validation failures, you need to do a failure investigation and determine what went wrong and take appropriate corrective and preventive action. Corrective and preventive action, as I mentioned, is the most important quality system element. The FDA always inspects CAPA, and they're going to look for signs that you have quality problems, and they're going to see if that came from validation issues. There's a linkage between validation and purchasing controls. When you're buying equipment, you have to show the specifications for what you met, that what you received was adequate, that you got it from a supplier that's on your approved supplier list. So don't be surprised if during the IQ, during an inspection, the FDA says during the IQ, did you get that piece of equipment from an approved supplier? Let me see your approved supplier list. They're going to pull that thread. Now, management is responsible for ensuring a suitable and effective quality management system. So if you have an inability to do these other things, if you have consistent problems with those other things, the FDA is going to say you have a management problem. And risk management, we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail, because as you're doing process validation, you want to think about what the risks are and how to prevent them. So we want to think of risk management for ISO 14971 as something that happens throughout the product life cycle, from the design phase to the production phase to post-production monitoring activities. And in the production phase, when you're doing your IQ, OQ, PQ, you want to think about risks and how they link to other parts of the quality system. So you're going to be collecting data and identifying what the risks are. You're going to characterize the severity of those risks and determine if they're acceptable or not. And you're going to put risk control measures in place. And that's a life cycle thing. So you're continually iterating your knowledge as you go along. Inspection, measuring, and test equipment for 21 CFR 820.72 is not explicitly validation, but we do see requirements that any inspection, measuring, or test equipment that you use during validation needs to meet these requirements. It needs to be suitable and capable. It needs to be routinely calibrated, checked, and maintained. You need to handle and store it properly. You need to calibrate it to known accuracy and precision standards. And it should be traceable to national or international standards. So any inspection equipment needs to meet this part of the regulation. Now let's switch to myths, challenges, and best practices. So there are lots of myths out there about validation. And I think one of the biggest things I see is that companies think validation is something you only do once. You validate and you're done. And that's not true at all. If you're changing your process, revalidation is explicitly required. But also, remember, you're supposed to monitor your process over time. And if you see any changes, any drift, any negative trends, any process failures, you need to review and evaluate and revalidate. If you've had any taken corrective and preventive action, you need to review and revalidate. It's not a static thing. This is a huge myth. Validation is only necessary when subsequent verification is impossible. In other words, you only need to validate if you can't do 100% inspection. And that's absolutely wrong. We do not want to rely on 100% inspection after the fact to sort good and bad product. We should still consider validation, because validation is how we optimize our processes, how we understand the process variables and decide what the optimum settings are. It's how we take risk reduction activities, and that's good for you, and that's good for your customers. So even if you can do 100% inspection, you should consider validation. And lastly, some people will tell you that validation is burdensome. And I will tell you that validation is a lot of work, but we're making medical devices. People's lives are depending on our products. So we need to think of validation as an investment. It's a value-added investment because it helps us understand and control our processes. We're not going to get surprises out of our processes. We're going to get more consistent results, reduced scrap, reduced work, reduced manufacturing costs. But mostly, we're going to get more consistent product. We're going to know that it's safe and effective for our customers. So validation is a lot of work, but it's value-added work. It's an investment because we're making medical devices. Challenges, there is always going to be pressure to cut corners. And if you cut corners, you're just going to have to do it over later on. Management really needs to help enforce an expectation of doing things right the first time, having a culture of quality. Best practices. I think some of the Six Sigma tools and process excellence tools that are out there are great tools to use. Process excellence, or Six Sigma, is all about process improvement and control. And that aligns exactly with what process validation is about. It helps you to understand and identify the sources of variation, how to control those sources of variation, and how to determine process capability. So some smart people have mapped some of the Six Sigma tools to IQ, OQ, PQ phases. You can Google that and you can find a lot of information out there. But I do recommend that the people on your staff that are responsible for process validation understand these concepts because they can really enhance your abilities to do validation. And most FDA inspectors understand these technical tools, especially tools like FMEA or DOEs or Pareto charts, things like that. Master validation plans are confusing to some people. And it's another thing that there is no requirement in the regulation for doing master validation plans. It's like the terms IQ, OQ, PQ. We find an expectation for it in the Global Harmonization Task Force guidance. And I think it's a good recommendation because a master validation plan really gives you additional detail on your approach to validation. It can describe what processes we're going to validate, what we're going to do, or how we're going to approach process improvement, our concept of wanting to meet customer satisfaction. So it's not required, but I think a master validation plan is a really good tool for you, and I recommend it. So just summarizing some of these activities. Validation, think of it not as a regulatory requirement. It's a critical tool, and it's good for you because it helps you understand and develop and improve and control your processes. You're going to get more predictable results. You're going to get consistent and better product. So do it because it really helps you make safe and effective products for your customers. We talked about the expectations. Today, we looked at a lot of the requirements, in the quality system regulation, as well as ISO 13485. And I really want to emphasize this important. Validation is good because it helps you control your processes. It helps you design and build quality in as opposed to relying on inspection after the fact. So validation really is a good tool for you. Use it because it's a good tool, not just because it's a regulatory requirement.